You know, it's often called the Forgotten War. It kind of gets lost, squeezed right there between the massive scale of World War II and the turbulence of Vietnam. But what if I told you this so-called forgotten conflict actually wrote the playbook for the next 40 years of global power struggles? Let's get into why this is one war we absolutely have to remember.
In this quote, it absolutely nails it. See, before 1950, the Cold War was mostly a war of words, of influence, of political posturing. But Korea changed the entire game. It took that ideological rivalry between superpowers and dropped it onto a real bloody battlefield. It created a dangerous new blueprint for how these giants would fight.
And that new blueprint has a name: the proxy war. Think about it. It's a truly strange and terrifying idea. The world's biggest powers, the US and the Soviet Union, fighting each other, but indirectly. They do it by arming and backing opposing sides on someone else's land. And in this case, the entire Korean Peninsula became the stage for their global struggle.
So, how did we get here? Where did this line in the sand even come from? Well, after World War II, Japan's occupation of Korea ended. The victorious allies, the US and the Soviets, made a fateful and honestly a pretty arbitrary decision. They just drew a line across a map, right on the 38th parallel.
But this wasn't just some line on a map for long. It became a very real ideological wall. To the north, the Soviets set up a communist state under Kim Il-sung. And in the south, the US backed a capitalist, anti-communist government led by Syngman Rhee. And just like that, the entire Cold War, that whole Iron Curtain concept, was dropped right down the middle of a single nation.
What happened next wasn't a single, straightforward conflict. Oh no. It was a brutal seesaw of a war that played out in 4 very distinct phases. The front lines just surged up and down the peninsula in this incredibly dramatic and devastating tug of war.
And then, on June 25, 1950, boom, all that simmering tension just exploded. The North launched a shocking, full-scale invasion across the parallel. This wasn't some minor border skirmish, this was a blitzkrieg. And it caught the South, and pretty much the entire world, completely off guard.
The North Korean forces just stormed south. They captured the capital, Seoul, in only 3 days. It was so fast, they pushed the South Korean and American defenders into this tiny little corner of the peninsula called the Pusan Perimeter. Seriously, it looked like the war was already over. In a desperate move, the United Nations, led by the US, made a historic call to intervene with military force.
And that intervention led to one of the most audacious, high-stakes gambles in modern military history. The UN commander, the legendary General Douglas MacArthur, wasn't just thinking about pushing the invaders back. No, he planned a massive, daring counterattack to cut them off completely. And that gamble? It was an amphibious landing at a place called Inchon, way behind enemy lines. It was incredibly risky. I mean, everyone thought it was nuts, but it worked perfectly. The move completely severed North Korean supply lines, trapping their army, and just like that, the tide had turned. Seoul was recaptured, and UN forces surged north, blowing past the 38th parallel and pushing all the way toward the Chinese border. The goal wasn't containment anymore, it was total victory. But as those UN forces got closer and closer to the Yalu River, that's the border with China, the war took another shocking, dramatic turn. A new and massive player decided to enter the game. China was seriously alarmed by having an American-led army right on its doorstep. So it unleashed what was basically a human wave. Hundreds of thousands of so-called volunteer soldiers poured across the border. The UN forces were completely unprepared for this new enemy, and they were sent into this brutal, freezing retreat all the way back down the peninsula. In a tragic reversal, Seoul fell again. After all those wild swings in the first year, back and forth, the war of movement just stopped. It ground to a bloody, miserable halt. The dynamic, fast-paced conflict devolved into a brutal war of attrition. For the next 2 years, the fighting was a horrific throwback to World War I. We're talking static, bloody trench warfare, with almost no ground gained or lost, just immense casualties. Finally, in 1953, the shooting stopped. An armistice was signed, creating the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, right around where it all started, the 38th parallel. But here's the crucial part. This was only a ceasefire. No peace treaty was ever signed. Okay, so while all these soldiers were fighting and dying in the mud and the cold, what was going on at the highest levels? To really get the full picture, we have to pull back from the battlefield and look at the global chess match being played by the superpowers. This table really breaks it all down.
For the US, the main goal was containment, stopping the spread of communism. For the Soviet Union, it was about expanding their sphere of influence without getting into a direct fight with America. For China, it was a defensive move to keep a buffer on its border. But for the North and South Koreans, for them, the goal was absolute and total, complete unification of the peninsula on their own terms.
And all this brings up a really critical question about the role of the United Nations in all of this. Was its first major military action a noble act of collective security, or was it basically just a political tool for American foreign policy? You can really see the two sides of the argument here. On one hand, the positive view is that this was the UN's first big test, right? The world acting together to stop a clear act of aggression. But the criticism is just as powerful. The UN action was almost entirely dominated by the US, in troops, in funding, in command, and that leads a lot of people to argue the UN was simply being used to achieve American objectives. The guns fell silent in 1953, sure, but the war itself, it never truly ended. And its consequences aren't just stuck in the past, they are still shaping our world in really profound ways today. The most obvious consequence, of course, is the permanent division of Korea, which created that heavily fortified, incredibly tense border that still exists. But globally, it supercharged the Cold War. It convinced the West that communism had to be fought with massive military spending, which kicked off a whole new arms race. And maybe the grimmest legacy of all, it set the precedent for future proxy wars, a pattern we'd see repeated tragically in places like Vietnam. So that leaves us with two huge questions. First, in a war this intense between superpowers, why didn't it go nuclear? The terrifyingly simple answer is that both sides were afraid of a retaliatory strike that would lead to mutually assured destruction. And second, why is it still unresolved? Well, because that armistice was never, ever replaced by a formal peace treaty. It left the two Koreas locked in an ideological stalemate and, technically, still at war.
When you boil it all down, this right here is the war's most profound legacy. Korea was the moment the Cold War turned hot. It set these terrifying new rules for the next 4 decades. Superpowers could wage brutal, devastating wars, but only by proxy, only by using other nations as a battlefield to avoid a direct world-ending nuclear clash.
Which really leaves us with one last, pretty unsettling thought to chew on. That armistice in 1953 stopped the shooting, but it didn't end the conflict. So you have to ask yourself, with no peace treaty ever signed, is the forgotten war really in the past at all?